Welcome back to the OSM channel. Now the question of the day, if you leave your precious dry season firewood exposed to rainfall for a period of about 24 hours, how does that affect the external moisture percentage as well as the internal moisture percentage of that wood? Well, today I've set up a little experiment and we are about to find out with this moisture meter. So first I want to talk about the experiment. We have 4 pieces of wood. There are 2 larger pieces and there are 2 smaller pieces of wood. These 2 samples right here were exposed to rainfall for a period of about 24 hours. Now all of these samples came from the same stack, the covered stack over there. These samples came from the same tree. It was a standing dead ash tree. And I split and stacked these pieces of wood about a year ago. Now aside from the last 24 hours of rainfall, which these 2 pieces have received, the seasoning conditions for all 4 pieces have pretty much been identical. So I think it's a pretty fair test here. Now first I want to talk about my experience. Now my experience has been always keep your firewood covered and ensure that it remains dry because obviously it's going to burn the best. What I have found is if I accidentally let my firewood, my dry season firewood, get exposed to rainfall, it just does not burn as well. The fire is cooler, the glass soots up more, and it's just a less efficient burn. I've also done testing on this. Should you cover your firewood stack or should you leave it uncovered? Which method allows the wood to season faster? Well, I did a video on that. If you haven't checked out that video, I'll leave a link for that video in the description down below. But I think the question that I didn't answer in that video, regardless of how you season your firewood, whether you leave it tarped or untarped, after the wood has seasoned, how does a rainfall affect the moisture percentages of that wood? Well, we're about to find out. I want to show you the chart real quick. This is how I'm going to write down all the data. So on the upper section of the chart, we have our dry pieces of wood, which again is our control. Small, large, and then beneath this center line, we have our wet pieces of wood, the small and the large one. Now we're going to be testing 4 areas on each piece of wood. First, we're going to take an external moisture reading. Then we're going to split each piece in half. We're going to take a moisture reading on the edge, the internal edge of that split, the midsection between the center and the edge, and then finally the center of each piece of wood. And we'll just write down all the data here. We're going to start with the large dry piece of wood. This is one of our controls. I'm probing with the grain. The external moisture percentage, 13.9%. Small dry piece of wood, probing with the grain. Our external moisture percentage is 12.6. Now for the rainfall exposed pieces, I mean visually you can tell this wood's wet. I'm guessing externally we're going to be in the 40s. So let's start with the small piece, again with the grain. Not as high as I was guessing. We're bouncing around 29%. And the large wet piece external measurement is a bit higher. 31.3. So off the bat, we're seeing a huge difference. To split the wood, we're going to be using this Biltard electric log splitter, which I have not used in about a year. I haven't really used this since I rebuilt that gas log splitter over there. So first we're going to be starting off with the small, dry control piece of wood. We're going to split it in half and take it over to the table and test the moisture percentages internally. I think the motor was a little bit seized up, so I took a stick and I manually spun the fan blade, and I think that got it freed up. Wow. Alright, our small dry piece of wood. Let's check the internal moisture readings. First we'll check on the edge. 12.1. Now mid is in between the center and the edge. So this is the mid section. 11.9. And then the center, 11.3. Alright, next let's split the large dry piece of wood. Oh. You guys alright there? I don't think we broke nothing. Ah, crud. We did. Damn it. Well, that kind of stinks. I spent $1,000 on this camera and the screen's all messed up now. Try and finish up this video anyway. But here we have our large dry piece of wood. So this is where the split was. Let's check our internal moisture readings. First on the edge, 15.3. Mid, pretty high, 28.2. Finally, center, 29.1. Onto the small piece of wet wood. Now color-wise, you can definitely tell the difference between the exterior and the interior of the wood. I mean, visually, the interior actually looks pretty dry, drier than I would have expected. But let's start probing with the moisture meter. So again, this is the wet piece of wood, the small piece, starting on the edge. Guess we'll start on the top edge. Definitely higher, 19.5. Midsection, 26.7. And finally, the center section, 24.2. And finally, let's crack open our large wet piece of wood. Now here's something interesting I noticed. I don't know if you guys caught it, but when we were splitting the dry control pieces of wood, when we ran them through the splitter, they almost exploded out of the wedge. As were both of the wet pieces, the rainfall exposed pieces, when they went through that wedge, they gradually split open. They didn't fire out of there like the dry pieces, so I found that to be quite interesting. Anyway, our final piece of wood that we're going to be testing here, I guess we'll test that piece. This is the large, wet, rainfall exposed piece. Again, you can definitely see the color difference between the internal and the external surfaces of the wood. So we'll start with the edge like we always do. 21.5, midsection 27.8, and finally the center 29.2. Alright, so what can we conclude from the data set here? Well, the first thing we can safely conclude is that the smaller you split your pieces of firewood, the faster they are going to season. And we can tell that because if we look at our dry control pieces of firewood, if we compare the small split piece of wood to the large piece of wood, look at the internal moisture percentages. You know, from the center and midsection readings, the small piece was around 12%, as were the large piece, you know, around 29%. So technically the large dry control is not really ready to burn because our ideal moisture percentage range would be 10 to 20%. So this is a little high. Now, from experience, I will tell you that if I were to pack my firebox for the overnight burn only of small pieces, well, I wouldn't get very far. So for me, it's really important to have some very large pieces to carry the burn out overnight. Other things we can conclude, if we take a look at the small dry piece of wood readings versus the small wet piece of wood readings, it definitely appears that rainfall affects the internal moisture readings on small pieces much more compared to the large piece. Like if we compare the large dry piece internal readings to the large wet piece internal readings, I mean, the moisture readings are not that different between the center and the midsections. However, if we take a look at our edge reading, that's where we start to notice a difference. You know, on the large piece, that moisture definitely penetrated in to the edge. You know, we can see a difference here, 15.3 on the edge versus 21.5 on the edge. Aside from that, another thing I did, I calculated the average moisture percentage between all four readings for each piece of wood, and I have that mapped out here. So if we take a look at the average moisture readings for the small piece of wood, the average moisture reading, rounding up, was about 12%. If we take a look at the average moisture reading for the small wet piece of wood, 24 hours of rainfall, look at that, over double, 24.9%. If we go to the large pieces, there is still a difference, but it's not as significant. So the average moisture reading for the large dry control piece, 21.6%, and the large piece that was exposed to the rainfall, 27.5%. And these are the key numbers that I really want you to pay attention to right here. So now to answer the question of the day, does it really make a difference whether your firewood is exposed to a little bit of rainfall before you throw it in the wood stove? According to these average moisture percentage readings, absolutely. Keep that firewood dry and it's just going to burn hotter and more efficiently. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for watching today's video. I'll leave a link for this moisture meter in the description down below. Now, if you have an idea for a future experiment, drop a comment down below. Anyway, again, I'd like to thank you for watching. As always, I will catch you on the next one.